There was a time when if something appeared in the media, we tended to believe it. After all, the news wouldn't lead us wrong, would it? We trusted newspapers and TV and radio. Didn't they have journalists and reporters and editors and investigators digging for the truth? Even with that naive belief, we still tipped into conspiratorial territory. I think a big tipping point was the assassination of JFK in 1963. When the Warren Commission report came out, millions of people just could not accept its findings that Lee Harvey Oswald was working alone. Then came the Vietnam War. Then stories of the CIA meddling in foreign governments and orchestrating coups. Then Watergate, which completely shattered trust. Since then, it's become normal to be suspicious, wary, and vigilant when it came to the BS that we're fed. What weren't governments and institutions telling us? What were they hiding? Well, a lot, as it turned out. That's now accepted fact. We're pretty accustomed to hoaxes by now. The internet has desensitized us. A celebrity has died? Well, let's wait for official confirmation. That photo looks incriminating. Gotta be a deep fake. Is that suspicious, salacious video real? Gotta be AI. But let's go back to a time before we became savvy and aware of how disinformation originated, spread, and then was accepted as gospel. I'm Alan Cross, and this is episode 71 of Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And we're going to wrap up this series on music's greatest conspiracies with the biggest music bamboozle of all time. This is the Paul is Dead hoax. The 1960s were a time when the relationship between institutions, corporations, the media, and the public began to change. Not only did trust start to erode, but people began to assume that whatever we were told was all lies, propagated by forces looking to manipulate us in some way. We began to see shadows, evidence of mischief and skullduggery, and things that weren't quite what they seemed to be. It's not necessarily that the public was gullible, although there is an element of truth to that. It's just that the public wasn't going to believe everything it was told. And if there was a thread that might lead to the truth, people started pulling on it. Watergate was a real scandal and crime. But then there were other avenues that were a little less than real. Some believe that the Beatles, as we know them, never existed. They, and here we go again, were manufactured as some kind of intelligence operation. Let's pull this apart from the beginning. The people behind the Beatles were allegedly shadowy agents and operatives at Britain's MI5. They employed the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, a real organization which has been studying the human condition from its headquarters in London since 1946. Before that, predecessors of the company, which is stocked with psychologists and psychiatrists, treated soldiers returning from the World Wars suffering from PTSD. Officially, the Tavistock Institute is deep into psychoanalytics that help companies solve workplace problems in ways that increase productivity and efficiency. Unofficially, some believe that the real specialty of the Tavistock Institute is the manipulation of large groups of people on behalf of governments and corporations. So in other words, mass mind control. According to this conspiracy, the Beatles were not four lads from Liverpool who had a nearly supernatural ability to write great songs, but an experiment in societal control financed by the UK government, led by a branch of the aristocracy founded in 1727 that controls global affairs. They have a sacred 300-page text, allegedly still followed today, entitled The Conspirators' Hierarchy, the Committee of the 300. The plan, it is said, was to introduce rock music and drugs into society to see what would happen. The result was the counterculture of the 1960s and all the music that went along with it. QAnon followers would later pick up on this concept and claim that the Beatles were used to promote wokeism, or maybe satanic practices, or pedophilia. It gets foggy after a while. We'll pick up on that later. But let's continue. Because things are so complicated, I'll lay out this evidence and then explain what really happened. The theory begins with the assertion that there were more than four Beatles. Members were swapped out and replaced as needed during the course of this experiment. And this brings me to one of the most enduring of all music conspiracies, the Paul is dead hoax. Believers say that Paul McCartney was killed in a car crash sometime in 1966 and replaced by a body double. How do they know this? Because the Beatles repeatedly dropped hints in their music, the artwork for their albums, and elsewhere. The story begins in early 1966 when rumors began to circulate that Paul was not well. Then, the Beatles, burned out by years of touring and recording, dropped out of sight after a final concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29, 1966. This was the pivot point for the Paul is dead story. Given that the Beatles had been in the public eye constantly since 1963, this disappearance was regarded as very suspicious. As the Beatles reimagined themselves as a studio-only band, interviews became a rare thing. Public appearances were sporadic at best, and the mop-top haircuts and sharp suits gave way to longer hair, mustaches, beards, and a completely different hippie kind of wardrobe. In September, Tony Barrow, the Beatles press officer, started getting phone calls from some British newspapers. "Is Paul okay?" they asked, or "Is he dead?" This was mixed with other stories that Paul was working to break up the Beatles and preparing to go solo. In January 1967, the rumors came back, and they were very specific. Paul had been driving along the M1 near London when he was involved in a terrible car crash. When did this happen? Well, one story is that it was late on November 8, 1966. A bloody stupid Tuesday, say the theorists. Paul stormed out of Abbey Road after a fight, jumped into his Austin Healey, and sped off. The crash was so horrible that Paul was decapitated. He was declared dead at 5 a.m. on the morning of November 9th, 1966. Good try, but between November 6th and 19th, 1966, Paul and Jane Asher weren't even in the country. They were on holiday, traveling through France and Kenya. Or maybe he died on December 26th, 1966. It is a fact that McCartney crashed his car that day, but he just chipped his tooth. He also got a scar on his upper lip, which he covered with a brand new mustache. Suspicious. The other day is January 7th, 1967. Another fatal car crash in a Mini Cooper, and also on the M1. And yes, that Mini Cooper was written off in an accident that day. And the owner of the car was Paul McCartney. But the driver and only occupant was a Moroccan student named Mohammed Hadij. Paul was not in the car. All right, so how did Hadij end up behind the wheel of Paul's Mini? He was an assistant to Robert Fraser, the owner of a London art gallery. The two of them were at McCartney's house earlier that day, along with Mick Jagger, Brian Jones, and an antiques dealer. And it was decided that they'd all head to Jagger's country house. Mick rode with Jagger in his car, and Hadij followed in Macca's Mini. The two cars became separated, and Hadij got into an accident. He was hurt too, but because the car was highly customized, it was immediately recognizable as belonging to Paul McCartney. There was a reference to the rumor that Paul had died in a Beatles fanzine called The Beatles Book in February 1967, which, because it had a circulation of nearly 500,000 subscribers, it only fanned the flames. The Beatles Book had credibility too, because it often featured articles written by Beatles roadies and associates Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans. But the Beatles Book story debunked everything as well. The story had the headline, "False Rumor," and I quote, "Stories about the Beatles are always flying around Fleet Street. The 7th January was very icy, with dangerous conditions on the M1 motorway, linking London with the Midlands. And towards the end of the day, a rumor swept London that Paul McCartney had been killed in a car crash on the M1. But, of course, there was absolutely no truth in it at all, as the Beatles press officer found out when he telephoned Paul's St. John's Wood home and was answered by Paul himself, who had been home all day with his black Mini Cooper safely locked up in the garage. So there we go. Glad we cleared it up. When the Beatles appeared together at a press conference in May of 1967 to announce the Sgt. Pepper album, Paul joked about the stories. Why would he do that unless he was trying to throw people off the scent? Complicating issues were actual Beatles impersonators. They existed. These men were lookalikes. who had been hired by Beatles management during the band's touring years to distract crazy fans whenever the Beatles needed to get in or out of a hotel or a venue. As I said, the existence of these impersonators is a fact. Celebrity decoys have been used for ages. But then some fans ran with the theory that these impersonators actually stood in for the Beatles at select shows. The idea of a lookalike Paul had been planted. By the time the Sgt. Pepper album was released on June 1st, 1967, the stories were still going strong. One journalist who was at a party celebrating McCartney's engagement to Jane Asher on Christmas Day 1967 was allegedly told by a friend that Paul was in fact dead and had been replaced by one of those lookalikes. Jane was just going along with the charade, which, by the way, was aided by MI5. So who was this lookalike imposter? His name was William Shears, or the Billy Shears referred to on track 1 of Sgt. Pepper. Or his name might have been William Shepard, a real-life human being named Richard Cook III, an American who met McCartney when he and the rest of the Beatles were visiting the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi in India in 1968. He's also the inspiration for the song The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill, which John wrote for the White Album. The Paul is Dead stories remained active in the background, with only super fanatics paying any attention to them. Then came September 17th, 1969. And this is when things got super weird. Stand by for more. Tim Harper was the editor of the Drake's Times Delphic, the student newspaper at tiny Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. In September of '69, he contributed an article entitled, "Is Beatle Paul McCartney Dead?" And this was a summary of all the rumors and gossip that he'd heard on campus that were based on clues that started appearing shortly after Sgt. Pepper was released. So let's go through them. This is a concept album portraying the Beatles as a fictional group. Interesting. What were they hiding? The artwork is strange. It features the Beatles in colorful military uniforms standing over what appears to be a grave surrounded by flowers. And those flowers were arranged in the shape of a left-handed bass, the kind that Paul McCartney played. Okay, so what did that mean? Is that a picture of Satanist Aleister Crowley in the crowd? Yes, it is. What did his appearance mean? Next to the new version of the Beatles on the cover is the old pre-Sgt. Pepper Beatles looking rather sad. Why so glum? Inside the gatefold sleeve is another picture of the band. Paul has a shoulder patch on his costume that reads OPD. That must stand for officially pronounced dead. Flip the record over, and there's another picture of the Beatles. Why does Paul have his back to the camera while the other three guys are facing it? And what about John's lyrics in A Day in the Life? He blew his mind out in a car. And John also says, he wants to tell us the truth. I want to turn you on. So that's it, the smoking gun, the references to Paul's death in the M1 car crash in 1966 or whenever. Tim Harper admitted that he wrote the piece for entertainment purposes only, and that he got all his information from another student named D'Artagnan Brown. Brown said he heard all this stuff while visiting California and had also seen a story in an unnamed underground newspaper. But hang on here, let's just go through all the pieces of evidence one by one. The idea of a fictional band came to Paul McCartney as the group was looking to create a new image. His thinking was if the band assumed an imaginary persona, they would be able to make music that was completely different from everything they'd done up until that time. This mask would permit them to experiment. The album cover was created by Peter Blake and Jan Haworth, based on the idea that the Beatles had just played a concert in a park and were hanging around with some of the audience members. Why not have fun with those audience members? Who might they be? The military uniforms? They were briefly in vogue when it came to British fashion in the first half of 1967, and those particular costumes were created with the help of the British theatrical costume company M. Berman. People in Ontario immediately recognized the patch on McCartney's shoulder. It didn't read OPD, it read OPP, and it featured the crest of the Ontario Provincial Police. The Beatles were given a patch in Toronto when they toured in 1964, and that gift was tossed in a box with all kinds of other things that they got. When M. Berman was styling the Sgt. Pepper uniforms, someone went through that box, they found the patch, and stitched it onto Paul's outfit. As for Paul's facing backward on the back cover, we're not sure. Could have been just a quirky choice. And finally, the "he blew his mind out in a car" line from A Day in the Life doesn't refer to Paul at all. John, who read all the papers every day, was inspired by the story of Tara Brown, an heir to the Guinness fortune who died in a car crash in December 1966. Brown had been a friend of the Beatles, and this is also how the line about potholes made the song. That was from the Daily Mail story about the need for road maintenance in Blackburn in Lancashire. The Paul McCartney is dead hoax may have fizzled out after Harper's story in the Drake Times Delphic, but then on October 12th, 1969, a DJ named Chris Gibb, who worked at WKNR-FM in Detroit, 600 miles away from the college in Des Moines, heard about the story via an anonymous phone caller who went by the name Tom. He opened the phone lines and took calls on the topic for an hour. Tom was adamant that Paul was dead and urged Gibb to pull out a copy of the White Album and spin it backwards. So he did. Whoa, another smoking gun, right? Well, let's hear that again. It just so happened that Fred Labour was listening that day. He was a student at the University of Michigan, and he wrote an arts column for the Michigan Daily. He took notes of what he heard on the radio and invented a few facts himself, including the name William Campbell, McCartney's alleged replacement. Now let's address that. Labour later came clean, and I quote, "I made the guy up. It was originally going to be Glenn Campbell with two N's, and then I said, nah, that's too close. Nobody will buy that. So I made it William Campbell." Labour's story was published on October 14, 1969, with the headline, "McCartney Dead, New Evidence Brought to Light." Again, he intended this whole thing to be nothing more than a joke. He wasn't prepared for the international attention it got. Shortly after that, Chris Gibb, the DJ at WKNR, ran a 1-hour special called The Beatles Plot. This is where things really blew up. The theories he floated became very popular locally, then regionally, then nationally, and then internationally. Okay, let's go through some of the audio clues the Beatles supposedly left behind. First up is the strange fade-out on John's Strawberry Fields Forever, released on February 13, 1967. What does this voice say? It's pretty quiet. Let's see if we can boost that a bit. If you hear the voice say, "I buried Paul," congratulations. You have just discovered another clue that Paul McCartney is in fact dead. One more time. Okay, now let's get real. The Beatles worked on Strawberry Fields in the 2 weeks leading up to Christmas 1967. They laid down many different takes, and the whole thing, frankly, was a mess, especially when it came to the different tempos and keys of the takes. On December 22nd, producer George Martin and engineer Jeff Emmerich were told by John that he liked elements of both the 7th take and take 26. Using just basic editing techniques and a single setting on the tape machine, they were able to join the two takes together. At the end of tape 26 were some flute sounds from a mellotron that were reversed. Then some trumpets, which sounded like a police siren. And then everything fades out into what's known as a false ending. Then the percussion fades back up, and that's where we hear Lennon saying in his slowed down voice, "I buried Paul." Let's get to "I Am the Walrus" from the Magical Mystery Tour, recorded across 4 days in September 1967. Again, plenty of acid was involved in its creation.
Serviceable villain. Dubious for the vices of my mistress, bandits of desire. Is he dead? Sit you down, father. Rest you.
You'll hear voices say, "Serviceable villain," and "Is he dead?" Let's listen again.
Serviceable villain. Dubious kiss for the vices of thy mistress and badness of desire. Is he dead? Sit you down, Father.
Okay, another clue. Paul is dead. In the song Glass Onion from the White Album, why does John sing this?
Well, here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul.
What? What's John going on about? Is it because the walrus represents death in some cultures? Yes, in fact, it does. Check out Inuit mythology. Now let's return to the song Revolution 9 on the White Album. It's an experimental collage of sounds created by John using library tapes found at EMI Studios that he cut up and spliced together in random ways.
Number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9.
Okay, now let's reverse that. Is the voice really saying, "Turn me on, dead man"? And there's more. Drop the needle right after the song "I'm So Tired" and spin it backwards, and you hear, "Paul is dead, man. Miss him, miss him." Let's do that again. Now let's skip ahead to the Abbey Road album, specifically the cover. We see the four Beatles walking across the crosswalk immediately south of the studio, and that procession is apparently loaded with symbolism. John is out front, dressed in a white suit, perhaps like a member of the clergy. Ringo comes second in a dark suit. He represents the Undertaker. Paul is third in a dark suit as well. Not only is he out of step with the other three Beatles, but he's barefoot. And if he's left-handed, why is he holding a cigarette in his right hand? Finally, it's George dressed in jeans. He's the gravedigger. So this is a funeral procession, right? And it's Paul's funeral. Look at the license plate on the VW Beetle in the background. It's LMW 281F. That must mean Paul would have been 28 if he'd lived. 281F. And the unidentified man on the sidewalk? Well, he symbolizes the angel of death. And fan theories kept popping up. Play Here Comes the Sun backwards at 78 RPM, and you get a voice that says, "Woe is Paul." Another rumor says that 87% of all coffins sold in the UK were made of Norwegian wood. They are not. And all the while, the Beatles press people had to deal with these panicked inquiries. Let's deconstruct everything. And we'll start with Strawberry Fields. John is not saying, "I buried Paul." He's actually saying cranberry sauce. Why? Lots of acid. John was a fan of the absurd. He loved surrealist humor. And this was an ad-lib, something that just spontaneously popped into his head while he was tripping. Lennon confirmed as much in one of his last interviews in 1980. The cacophony at the end of I Am the Walrus was created using the Mike Sam's Singers, a 16-member group of vocalists. The spoken word pieces were randomly recorded from the BBC via an AM radio Lennon was fiddling with, and he just happened to land on a reading of King Lear, specifically Act 4, Scene 6. Here is the text, the first of which is heard halfway through the song. "Gloucester, now good sir." "What?" "Edgar, poor man, made tame by fortune, good pity." Then we can skip to the ending. At 3 minutes and 52 seconds, Oswald says, "Slave, thou hast slain me. Villain, take my purse. If ever thou wilt thrive, bury my body, and give the letters which thou find'st about me. Seek him out upon the British party. Oh, untimely death." At 4 minutes and 23 seconds, Edgar says, "I know thee well, a serviceable villain, as duteous to the vices of thine mistress as badness would desire." Then we move back to Gloucester, who says, "What? Is he dead?" And finally, Edgar, at the very end of the fade-out, says, "Sit you down, father. Rest you." This is a total coincidence. It's just what Lennon happened to grab from the radio at that moment. Much of I Am the Walrus was written while Paul, again, was tripping on acid. Now that you know that, listen to the lyrics again. And John says he threw in a whole bunch of lines deliberately to confuse people. In fact, when talking about the song, John was quoted by a biographer as saying, "Let the effers work that one out." John was like that. The voice on Revolution 9 belongs to a studio engineer at EMI Studios named Alistair Taylor. He was introducing take number 9 on a test recording for the Royal Academy of Music, and his full introduction was, "This is EMI test series number 9. The brain hates chaos and loves patterns. If it thinks it hears something, then pattern recognition kicks in. And if you were told in advance that the voice says, "Turn me on, dead man," in advance, that's all you'll be able to hear. Now let's go back to the Abbey Road cover. It was shot by a photographer named Ian McMillan at around 11:30 in the morning on August 8th, 1969. He was given all of 10 minutes to stop traffic and take his shots from a stepladder. The band came directly from the studio, and that's how they were all dressed that day. It was apparently very hot, so Paul took off his shoes. The fact that he's out of step probably has to do with the fact that they had so little time to coordinate everything. What about the license plate on the Bug? Total red herring. On August 8, 1969, Paul was 27 years old, not 28. And the mysterious anonymous man? It's claimed that that's Paul Cole, an American businessman visiting London, who just happened to be walking by when the shot was taken. He has nothing to do with anything, although some theorists have labeled him as some sort of supernatural presence, maybe an angel or perhaps even Satan himself. Okay, so is that it? Are we done? No, we are not. There's still more to the Paul is dead theory, and that's coming next. We have a few more stops to make before we come to the conclusion of the Beatles' great Paul is dead conspiracy. On October 21st, 1969, the Beatles press officers felt that they had to make another statement that Paul was in fact alive and well. To emphasize that point, the BBC granted a rare interview with Paul at his farm. The interview was broadcast in the UK and syndicated internationally, and there was a feature in Life magazine on November the 7th with Paul, Linda McCartney, and the family on the front cover. Paul was originally hostile to that. The writer showed up unannounced at Macca's Scottish farm, and Paul greeted him by tossing a bucket of water on him. But eventually he agreed to a sit-down, and that seemed to put everything to rest. Almost. On October 26th, Lennon called WKNR in Detroit, telling listeners, "It's the most stupid rumor I've ever heard." On November 30th, 1969, there was an American TV special called Paul McCartney, The Complete Story Told for the First and Last Time, and it featured lawyer F. Lee Bailey arguing the evidence. One of the witnesses was Fred LaBour, as well as a few other proponents of the theory. Alan Klein, the Beatles' manager, was also interviewed, and in the end, there was no verdict. The TV show just let the viewer decide. But let's remember, everybody involved in the production of the TV special knew that LaBour's original story was a joke, deliberately a joke. Meanwhile, songs started turning up. A group called Billy Shears and the All-Americans released a song called Brother Paul. Jose Feliciano released So Long Paul under the pseudonym Werbly Finster. Zacharias and the Tree People released We're All Paul Bearers, which brought attention to the black carnation Paul was wearing for the Sgt. Pepper album. The Paul is Dead story continued to have legs. In fact, it's become completely ingrained in popular culture. References have turned up everywhere from Batman comic books and especially comedy sketches. This is from February 13th, 1993. Paul McCartney was the guest on Saturday Night Live, and Chris Farley tried his best to interview him, but it came off very, very awkward.
Okay. You remember when you were with the Beatles and you were supposed to be dead, and there's all these clues that, like, he'd play some song backwards and it'd say, like, Paul is dead, and everyone thought that you were dead or something.
Yep.
That was a hoax, right?
Yeah, I wasn't really dead.
Right.
McCartney has fun with the whole thing. There was a live album in 1993 called Paul is Live. No question about what he was poking fun at there, especially since it came with artwork that also poked fun at the whole thing. There's a reference to the hoax in the video for the Beatles' 1995 song Free as a Bird. When McCartney showed up on The Simpsons, he provided a backwards version of Maybe I'm Amazed that's played over the end credits. If you play that backwards, you get this. Buried in the audio is Paul reading the recipe for lentil soup. Oh, wait, can we stop this? Isolate what he says at the 44-second mark.
Oh, by the way, I'm alive.
Did you catch that? He says, by the way, I'm alive. Let's hear it again.
Oh, by the way, I'm alive.
There are more examples of Paul having fun with things. But now we have to take a darker turn because this brings us back to the QAnon people. Back before the internet, our rock star heroes were remote, mysterious, and untouchable. It was easy to believe that they had special powers and special things happened to them. Social media has broken down all those walls, and we're closer to musicians than we've ever been. That means to find the truth, these conspiracies, investigators have to go deeper. There are corners of the QAnon world that harken back to that mysterious 1727 text entitled The Conspirators' Hierarchy. This is somehow connected to the Beatles being a psyop designed to popularize all things woke beginning in 1963. They invoke a name, Dr. John Coleman, allegedly of MI5, who, as I said earlier, was financed by the British government to create the counterculture of the 1960s using the resources of the Tavistock Institute. This is known as the Aquarian Conspiracy, and the Beatles weren't the only creations. Both the Rolling Stones and the Grateful Dead came out of this experiment. Evidence is cited. The infamous Butcher cover, the withdrawn artwork for the Beatles' Yesterday and Today album. It features, apparently, elements of shaitan, which in Islamic tradition is a demonic spirit. The Sgt. Pepper album is a tribute to Satanist Aleister Crowley, and the Beatles are displaying a secret Masonic gesture. This somehow connects to pedophilia and child sacrifice. Here's a post from a true believer. The death of Paul is an entry conspiracy theory. Once you realize how much you've been lied to about the Beatles, even if only in small ways where you still think Paul is Paul, it primes you for accepting much of your culture has been a psyop and false. Someone posted this. If Paul McCartney is really dead and they deceived people back in the late 60s, can you imagine what they can do now? The theories spread out in all directions. The Beatles were in contact with Charles Manson and somehow directed him. Lennon's Imagine was designed as a globalist national anthem, and that Mark David Chapman was a patsy under mind control, which led him to assassinate John Lennon. Oh dear, this is quite weird. But the whole thing is weird, isn't it? It's one of those rock and roll myths and conspiracies that just won't go away. Oh, and by the way, Russ Gibb, the DJ who started all this, he died in 2019. Paul McCartney declined to comment, and I think we can probably leave it there. If you want more, there's plenty in the Uncharted archives. Episode 4 speaks of the satanic panic regarding rock in the 1980s. Episode 6 talks about how the CIA had Bob Marley killed. Episode 12 is a deep dive into the Kurt Cobain was murdered conspiracy. Episode 19 explores whether Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones was murdered. Episode 28 speaks of the whole 27 Club conspiracy. And I touch on some weird conspiracies in the assassination of John Lennon in episode 29. And if you want something truly bizarre, I'm going to plug this other podcast, look up the Wind of Change podcast. The truth is out there, or some approximation of it. Whatever. If you have any questions or comments about anything you hear on this podcast, including, of course, any conspiracy theories, just email me at alan@alancross.ca. We can also meet up on all the social media sites, along with my website, which is a journalofmusicalthings.com. It's updated daily with music news and recommendations. It also comes with a free daily newsletter filled with music news, opinion, and music recommendations. And then there's my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music and alternative music through the decades. And there are hundreds and hundreds of episodes. You can enjoy that one all for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical productions by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.